Resistance to his policies in Soviet Ukraine, Stalin argued, was of a special sort, perhaps not visible to the imperceptive observer. Opposition was no longer open, for the enemies of socialism were now quiet and even holy. The kulaks of today, he said, were gentle people, kind, almost saintly. People who appeared to be innocent were to be seen as guilty. A peasant slowly dying of hunger was, despite appearances, a saboteur working for the capitalist powers in their campaign to discredit the Soviet Union. Starvation was resistance, and resistance was a sign that the victory of socialism was just around the corner. Stalin never personally witnessed the starvations that he so interpreted, but comrades in Soviet Ukraine did. They had somehow to reconcile his ideological line to the evidence of their senses. Forced to interpret the distended bellies as political opposition, they produced the utterly tortured conclusion that the saboteurs hated socialism so much that they intentionally let their families die. Thus, the racked bodies of sons and daughters and fathers and mothers were nothing more than a facade behind which foes plotted the destruction of socialism. Even the starving themselves were sometimes presented as enemy propagandists, with a conscious plan to undermine socialism. Young Ukrainian communists in the cities were taught that the starving were enemies of the people who risked their lives to spoil our optimism. Hello, welcome to Revenant Reads. I am Vin, and this is another edition of Fresh Red Kills, and I've just read from Bloodlands, Europe between Hitler and Stalin. So, Fresh Red Kills is where I talk about books that I have recently finished reading, and I'm going to be talking about two that I read at the end of December. So this is finishing up actually my fourth quarter of Historathon 2023. We're now into January of 2024, so a new year of Historathon has begun, and these were my last two of the previous Historathon. So a little bit late to the game, but that's how it works. I don't do weekly reads videos because I don't have a regular recording schedule. I record when I can and really when I feel like it. So I'm always a little bit behind, and I'm totally okay with that. So here we go. I'm finally wrapping up December of 2023. So I read two things, as you can see, actually, from World War II, dealing a lot with the Holocaust and suffering. So first I read Bloodlands, again, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin by Timothy Snyder. I did this as a buddy read with John David, who was one of my co-hosts for Historathon. And afterwards I followed it up with a kind of young adult book about the Holocaust, a nonfiction book. So I'll talk about each of these. I don't do formal reviews necessarily. I just kind of talk about my thoughts, and you can do with that what you will. So, Bloodlands. This is one that I've been wanting to read for quite a while now. And what Timothy Snyder is doing here, which I'll say it right off, this was a hell of a book. I was really, really impressed. It's not a fun read. It's dark. It's really dark stuff. It reminded me a lot of when I read Iris Chang's The Rape of Nanking a few years ago. And I had to do kind of a similar thing that I did with that book. If I remember, I'll leave a link to my video from when I read that and discussed it. But essentially, what this book deals with, it deals with so much death and so much suffering that there were times when it was a kind of book where I had to kind of put it down and walk away for a little bit. Not because, it wasn't like emotionally trying. It was because I was afraid of becoming desensitized to what I was reading. So I would purposely set it aside so I can digest what it was, because there are so many times in this book where, he's basically, you're being assaulted with numbers of people dying. It's like, 1,000 people killed here, 1,500 there, 2,000 there. And you have to consciously keep reminding yourself that these aren't just, of course, numbers. These are people. And to his credit, he does give us some specific incidents to give, some kind of human face, if not a face, at least an experience, a little bit of humanity to those numbers. And I think he does a very good job with it. And of course, the stories, as you can imagine, are absolutely horrifying. I kept thinking, I don't remember if I brought this up on the previous video that I did for The Rape of Nanking, so I might be repeating myself if I did. But when I was a substitute teacher, teaching high school at one point, there was a guest speaker who came in who was a poet, and he wrote war poetry, anti-war poetry. And one of the things I remember him saying to the students when we talk about these huge numbers, whether it be the Holocaust or other conflicts. And, your brain can't necessarily handle those numbers and, kind of humanize them. He had essentially said, he told all the kids to, close their eyes. And he said, now, picture your mother or somebody that's dear to you. Now imagine them being shot and killed, right? Now, do it again. Imagine it again. Do it again. Do it again, right? And you do that. If you can do that 6 million times in a row, you have some idea what the Holocaust was. And it was that kind of mental exercise that was in the back of my head, and it made me conscious of wanting to make sure that I was not becoming desensitized to how horrible, life was in Eastern Europe. So I'm sorry, I'm getting my videos are very unscripted, so this is just me kind of talking off the cuff. So Timothy Snyder, he looks at the early 1930s all the way up through really a little bit after World War II. I guess you could say early 1950s. And he is essentially looking especially at Poland and Ukraine, and again, the Europe between Hitler and Stalin. And he's not looking at these entities necessarily separately. He's looking at the people who are caught in the middle of this. These two very vicious and just insane regimes that killed so many. Of course, Hitler, we all know him from the Holocaust, of course, and Stalin, the Soviet Union was killing more people in peacetime, more civilians in peacetime than in wartime. And you have these people who are just constantly caught in the middle of these two psychos in a lot of ways. And, it's one after the other. First, the Soviet Union comes in, and there's mass death, there's starvation, especially if it's Ukraine being starved on purpose, or if it's Poland, people are being, basically being accused of working against the state. And then the Nazis come in and take over. Now they're dealing with that. And, then eventually the Soviet Union will come back in. And no matter what, you have these two regimes that have this disgusting, flawed logic. One that's, of course, the logic corrupted by racism. And, Stalin, it's kind of corrupted by this obsession over class. But either way, it creates a situation in which innocent people are killed in huge numbers. And they're seen really as, just necessary deaths, or almost like cannon fodder to the cause. He looks in detail at basically the famine in Ukraine, when Stalin purposely starved that country in the early 1930s. He goes through the deal that Stalin and Hitler made, the pact they made, the non-aggression pact, and then when they both invade Poland. And he talks about the Molotov-Ribbentrop line, which I don't know if that's his term or not, but basically the dividing line, right? So the Soviet Union took one half of Poland, the Nazis took the other. And then, of course, and there's death happening on either side. And then, of course, Hitler betrays Stalin. Who would have thought he would be untrustworthy? And the Nazis sweep through and take over that area. And, of course, eventually the Soviet Union pushes back. And all the while, people are suffering. And it's just this kind of crazy insanity. You can see why George Orwell had a ball with things like Stalinism and the crazy sort of thinking that they did. The Nazis were far more just out in the open about their hating and their killing. And whereas under Stalin, people had to play like a mental game and pretend that what they saw wasn't happening. Kind of like that passage I read about people starving in Ukraine and saying that bloated corpse, they purposely did that in order to try and undermine socialism and communism. I mean, it's just absolutely crazy. This is not a specific example. I am basically, I'm summarizing a little bit because I don't remember the exact details or the page number. But they'll talk about how, Stalin, I think it came with especially with the way the Poles were treated. Stalin would say, we have to root out people who are working against the state. And then the local, basically the local administrators, they would be told from the top that, you have to basically get rid of like 2,000 enemies of the state. Now, of course, there aren't actually enemies of the state. So these administrators have to come up with 2,000 people to kill. in order to meet that quota. But they're not just expected to meet the quotas, they're expected to exceed the quota. So don't kill 2,000, kill 4,000, right? So you have 4,000 people dead, but then the administrators, will be told, well, how were you so incompetent that you had 4,000 people working against the state and you didn't do anything about it beforehand? Either you're that incompetent or you are working with them, and either way, now you're going to be executed. And there's just this kind of mental game of pretend that they constantly have to be working through to, uphold the ideology. There was a lot that I learned in this. I knew the basics going into this. I didn't know a lot of the details, so I learned a lot, especially with things like the Holocaust and the final solution. I didn't realize that the original final solution was to deport the Jews. At one point on Madagascar, which is kind of interesting. That's not something I thought. That also surprised John David in our conversations. But really, it was to send the Jews. The idea was to take over the Soviet Union and then to send the Jews out to the east. And then things like Ukraine, Eastern Europe would become this idyllic kind of community of German farmers in this breadbasket. But of course, the war against Stalin does not work out the way Hitler wants. It takes way too long, and the Nazis don't have winter clothes, and they're starting to die in the winter as the winter sets in Russia. So they change plans, and instead of deporting the Jews, they start executing them. And that Molotov-Ribbentrop line, depending on whether or not the Soviet Union had taken control of its side of Poland or if it was Germany, often determined the fate of how the Jews who were in that situation now, where the Nazis had taken over, how they would die. So if they were in the eastern side, they would most likely be shot, especially in front of pits, or if they were in the western side, they would be gassed in extermination camps. And he does emphasize the difference between labor camps and extermination camps. Auschwitz was obviously absolutely horrible and deadly, but he makes the point that it was also half of like a work camp. So that's why we know more about Auschwitz, because there were more survivors. Not nearly as many survivors from things like Treblinka, which was just a straight up execution machine. And he takes us through World War II. He takes us to the Holocaust, through the ghettoization of cities, the liquidation of the ghettos, just the absolute horrors that people went through, whether it was under the Soviet Union or the Nazis. And of course, you have the defeat of the Nazis. And then he finishes it off with a really interesting final chapter / almost like epilogue about how, especially Stalin and the Soviet Union, started rewriting history and kind of minimizing the suffering of Jews and making the Soviets out to be the ones who really suffered and who really stood up against Hitler, ignoring the fact that Stalin and Hitler were partners at one point. But this was a really excellent work, and the amount of research he had to do for this and the figures, there is so much going on in here. And across, it's Eastern Europe. It's a pretty large area, of course. Yeah, I was thoroughly impressed with this. If you are somebody who is interested in World War II, especially, and you haven't read this, I highly, highly recommend it. Now, excuse me, while I was reading this, so a few of my previous videos over a few weeks had more to deal with comic books because this was just kind of so dark. And again, I didn't want to distract from the human suffering. So I didn't want to read a novel at the same time that I did this, because I always have multiple books going on. And I didn't want to read any other history. So I would just read like comic books while I did this, so that it was so far different from this that I was able to mentally focus in the way that I wanted to. However, I guess I'm a glutton for punishment, because after I finished this, I then went on to read this. Survivors, True Stories of Children in the Holocaust. This is a scholastic book. Now, I am a middle school social studies teacher, and at my school, I have, this is my second year doing it now, created a history book club, where every single month we choose a different book, and it could be historical fiction, it could be historical nonfiction, it could be a graphic novel. But essentially, kids who want to participate, we read it throughout the month, we meet every week and we discuss it. And for January, I picked this book because it's fairly cheap for them to get. And I read it, of course, in the last week of December after I finished Bloodlands. So this is written for a younger audience, and it is 8 stories of young people, mostly children, like around the age of 10 sometimes, in the Holocaust. And it gives a pretty good, and the true stories, gives a good spectrum, wide spectrum look at the different experiences that people had. And as the stories go on, they do get progressively darker and more harrowing. In the beginning, we have a girl who's inside a more urban environment that is just trying to hide from the Nazis, and there's a family keeping her in a trunk at one point for a long time so that people don't know that she's there. People trying to leave the country, and then as it progresses, we get more and more into the concentration camps and the death marches and things like that. Now, it's written for young people, but it doesn't really pull its punches. It deals with some dark stuff and some really terrible, moral gray areas. At one point, there's a 10-year-old, I think he's 10 at the time, he basically escaped and he becomes a partisan. And he is made basically to execute a 16-year-old girl for, they're accusing her of being a collaborator with the Nazis. And he is forced to basically pull the trigger and murder this girl. Even of course, though he doesn't want to. So it doesn't shy away from that kind of thing. But of course, because it's written for younger people, it doesn't go into the details, right? It kind of gives just enough so you understand what's happening without, elaborating too much on some things that would be more inappropriate for the age. But overall, I was actually quite impressed by this. It was, even as an adult reading this, it was amazing, these stories. And the way that I'm going to do this with my students is we're going to read 2 stories a week, and then after a month, we'll be done. I read this thing straight through, and it just became kind of, exhausting reading about how it's one dark story of suffering after another. There's one about a family who spent basically 2 years inside an attic, waiting, and hiding, having to be incredibly quiet. And this attic was not insulated, and when it snowed, it would just snow right on them. And some of them were dying up there, and it's just insane what people went through. Of course, it's the Holocaust. What do you think? But it turned out to be a pretty good companion piece to this. It helped to give, once again, more of like that human face, and the more personal experiences to what this provided the context for it. So anyhow, these are the 2 that I read for the end of Historathon 2023, which, if you look through my videos, you'll find the Historathon announcements. It's basically a year-long reading event where we read and we discuss and we celebrate nonfiction history, and we divide the year up into 4 quarters. The last quarter for 2023 was October, November, December, where we looked at the years 1820 to the present. So at the end of December, I was focusing on World War II. So if you've read any of these, I'd love to hear your thoughts, as dark as they may be. And I would actually recommend both of them. So as always, thank you, BookTube.